Good evening, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to our webinar, which will be about UN intelligence gathering, and more specifically about the UN case in Mali. Your hosts tonight will be Arne Simamani and myself, Max Garcia Hoogland. The duration of the webinar will be about 1 hour. And we will discuss UN intelligence gathering in general, but we will also dive into the specifics of the UN mission in Mali. You can, if you have any questions, you can write them down in the Q&A box down below, and we can try to answer them whilst we're doing this webinar, but there will be a room at the end of the webinar to answer your questions. Of course, this topic can be quite technical, and therefore we have invited two experts in the field of UN intelligence gathering. But before we introduce them, we would like to show a short clip about our organization, the Jason Institute, and we will just briefly go through the planning of tonight's webinar. So first of all, we will show you the video. Let's see if it works in that sense. Just one moment. It's always the technical things that are the most difficult. Oh, unfortunate.
Due to the fragile international security climate, Jason considers it vital to keep students and young professionals informed on matters of international peace and security. Jason Institute is a non-profit organization based in The Hague. For over 50 years, Jason Institute has provided information and insights about a wide area of subjects, such as like the crisis in Liberia, the nuclear proliferation of North Korea, world politics, global finance, cybersecurity, climate change, and global warming. You might be wondering how we make sure that this information actually reaches the public. We take care of this by writing online articles and by publishing our own Jason magazine. The magazine is published 4 times a year and focuses on themes related to international politics and international security. Best thing about that, it's for free. Besides that, we also organize symposiums, workshops, crash courses, excursion, and simulation games to make sure the public is informed about what is going on in the world. Jason Institute, your trustworthy source reporting about peace and security.
Okay, so I hope it was possible for everyone to hear. Then we will briefly go over the structure of tonight's webinar, which will mainly the overview will be quite easy to understand in that sense. So first we'll have a general introduction on the UN intelligence operations. We will talk about the realities of UN intelligence gathering and the case of the UN mission in Mali. What's also quite important to note is the challenges that were faced in Mali and in regards to the intelligence gathering in this mission. And then we'll have a quick recap and conclusion on the things we've discussed during the webinar, and there will be room for a Q&A. Without further ado, we'll now introduce our speakers of tonight, and I will start with introducing our first speaker, which will be Ellen Regeling. And Ms. Ellen Regeling is currently working as a peacekeeping intelligence program officer at the United Nations headquarters in New York. So not only can Ms. Regeling talk about the UN intelligence gathering in a more general sense, but she can also discuss the UN case in Mali, which will be a good example of how UN intelligence really works in practice. Before being a peacekeeping intelligence program officer, She also worked as a senior information analyst at the Joint Mission Analysis Center, which was also during the MINUSMA mission, so the UN mission in Mali. And she also worked as an assessment officer with the Office of Military Affairs, and this was also at the headquarters of the United Nations in New York. And there she was the desk officer for the MINUSMA mission. So I would now ask Arnis to introduce the second speaker of tonight.
Yep, thank you, Max. I hope you all can hear me. I will introduce Lieutenant Colonel Martin Alderton. He's a former company commander for the ISR units, which are intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance units for the UN mission in Mali. As Max already mentioned, named MINUSMA. These ISR companies were tasked with gathering and processing intelligence for the military commander for the main peacekeeping mission headquarters in Bamako. He was stationed himself in the city of Gawa, leading the multinational team of nearly 80 people from 6 different nationalities, operating in a variety of sensors for a period of 4 months. Before that, Mr. Alderton served in several other positions related to military intelligence. For example, in the Royal Dutch Army. He now works as an exchange officer for the German Armed Forces close to Berlin. Additionally, before we start, I would like to add that Mr. Alderton will not be speaking on the behalf of the Dutch Ministry of Defense, but will be more or less speaking about his own experiences and on behalf of himself. And before we go into the webinar itself, I would like to ask both of our speakers your motivation for joining us tonight. Maybe we could start with Ms. Reckling.
Unmute, that's better. All right. Yeah, I've been working on the development of intelligence in the United Nations, which we call peacekeeping intelligence, for quite a few years now. And I believe that it's very important to try and further professionalize this practice in UN peace operations to make them more safe and more effective. So when I was asked to join this seminar, yeah, I gladly accepted.
Thank you very much for joining us, and Mr. Alderton.
Yeah, let me first take the opportunity to thank you for the invite for tonight's webinar. Yeah, my sole motivation to contribute to this webinar is, since I've been on the ground in a UN mission, having the opportunity to gather a lot of experiences and insights, that is worthwhile sharing these experiences with people who are already working in the field of international security or will be working in this field in the future. So I'm just here to share my knowledge and experiences with you guys.
Thank you so much for both joining us once again tonight. And let's start going into the topic. So I will give a slight introduction into the MINUSMA mission in Mali and what it basically was. So the mission itself was established in 2013 in April, after the UN resolution 2100 was passed. And it was made after the need to stabilize the political processes in the country of Mali after the Tuareg rebellions in 2012. Then the mission also was the first UN peacekeeping mission with a very sophisticated and Western intelligence apparatus. However, it was noticed that with bringing these Western technologies and Western techniques into such an environment, there were some shortcomings and some things that were demonstrated that were lacking that we will further discuss into the webinar. So I would like to give the floor now to Max with our first questions for our first subtopic.
Yeah, thank you, Arnis. Yes. So indeed, we will now dive more into UN intelligence gathering in general. And I've a question for both of you, and I would like to ask this question first to Mrs. Regeling. And this question mainly is, how could UN intelligence gathering be understood? And does UN intelligence gathering differ from the normal ways of intelligence gathering? Yeah,
so intelligence gathering in the UN, well, intelligence in general, as a word, has been kind of a forbidden word due to political sensitivities within the UN. So the first policy on peacekeeping intelligence, it's only 4 years young. It stems from 2017. Intelligence in general is one of those tradecrafts that is normally the prerogative of a nation state. And the UN being a global and multilateral organization, it was kind of a challenge to get member states to agree on what kind of intelligence the UN in peace operations could and could not do. Main differences between what the UN does with peacekeeping intelligence and what you say normal ways of intelligence, nice phrasing by the way, is firstly that peacekeeping intelligence has quite a limited applicability. It means that UN can gather intelligence only in peacekeeping operations, and then in addition only for the goals of safety and security of UN personnel, protection of civilians, and also situational awareness. Secondly, UN personnel working in peacekeeping intelligence cannot just use any intelligence measures that they find effective. They're quite limited in that, and for example, clandestine activities are not allowed within the UN.
Okay. Yeah, and if I can ask this question to Mr. Alderton as well, do you, in this sense, agree with Mrs. Reglinger's point of view, or do you think there is some nuance in this aspect?
Well, I think it's important to realize where the UN came from, especially looking back to the 90s of the last century, where these horrible events took place in Rwanda and in Srebrenica, and that really opened the eyes of the UN that something had to happen. And you can see that there have been several evaluations. One of the most well-known ones is the Brahimi Report, at the turn of the century, and one point that stood out is that actually the UN missions were blind, so future UN missions would need intelligence to be more effective and to reach the mandate they have been given. So this eventually changed on the ground when MINUSMA, so the UN mission in Mali, was created. And this specific dedicated intelligence asset was actually attached to the UN mission. So it's important to realize it was actually the first time that what was evaluated and written down in this Brahimi report was effectualized by this intelligence unit for the UN mission in Mali. It's not to say that the UN didn't start using intelligence before, because there's a concept of the Joint Mission Analysis Cell, where Ms. Regling also worked, that has also been introduced as of 2005, but slowly the UN evolved into what is now known as this ASIFU concept, so this All Sources Intelligence Fusion Unit, what was actually brought into effect in Mali. So that is really really important to understand where the UN came from, to the point that this ASIFU unit was created. So do the goals differ? So to my opinion, they do not, because also in the UN mission, the goal was actually to support the threats to the force and the threats to the mission. So intelligence should contribute to minimize any negative influence on both aspects. So as well the threat to the force as the threat to the mission. And that is similar in, so to say, normal military intelligence, where intelligence is used in the same manner. So from my perspective, the goals do not really differ between a UN mission or a more regular military operation.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And could you then say that, looking at the work you've done when it comes to intelligence gathering, was it more of a preventive nature, so before a particular event happened, or was it more reactive, so based on what happened, intelligence was gathered in your work?
Yeah, there can only be one answer to that, because intelligence is always preventive, since intelligence is there to support decision making. So the products that are being made by intelligence units are provided to the commander, and based on the assessments made in these intelligence products, the military commander can make the best planning possible. You can compare that, for example, with a weather forecast. If I tell you that it's going to be sunny tomorrow, you can still decide that you want to bring an umbrella. And then in the event that it actually starts to rain, then you have the umbrella available. And that works the same way with intelligence. So it is a prognosis, it is an assessment, and it is up to the military commander how he works this assessment and how he uses that in his mission planning. But it is always on the upfront a mission. And yes, of course, when an incident happens, that is being exploited, but it's only being exploited to learn from it, to make sure that such an event can be evaluated to prevent such an event from happening again, or to use the information to the benefit of your own unit.
Exactly. So you would describe the information you're getting then as different than from the intelligence in which we're talking now. So information that will be based or will be used to base your decision upon.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much for answering this question. I believe, just to be sure, that for Mrs. Regeling, would you also agree with this standpoint, or is your view critically different?
I fully agree. No, it was a great description. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
And based on that sort of the preventive approach that intelligence has, what would you say are, in general, the sort of pros and cons to intelligence gathering? In other words, are there any risks involved, or in the sense of false security? Maybe both of you can give an answer from a more technical approach and a sort of a general, wider policy approach. If Regeling, if you like to start, yes.
Yep, sure, no worries. So yeah, of course there are risks in intelligence gathering, and same goes for peacekeeping intelligence. An obvious risk that we encountered was the safety of the sources when you talk of, for example, getting intelligence from human sources. In certain regions in Mali, we've seen that locals have been accused of providing information or intelligence to either the French counterterrorism operation or to the UN mission, with, in some cases, death as a result. And obviously the UN takes those things very seriously and tries to incorporate elements of that in their policies and guidelines to make sure those things don't happen, or at least to minimize the risks. Another risk, or another element, I should say, that we take very seriously is privacy. So the UN tries to be very careful of what it should do and what it can and cannot do with the data it gathers. For example, the unmanned aerial systems, or the drones that fly over certain regions. How can we store the data? How can we share the data? And there's many rules and regulations that are governing the practices of intelligence. Those rules and regulations are being developed alongside the development of the intelligence practices within the UN.
Oh, thank you very much. And Mr. Alderton, do you have any comments or aspects that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, well, as a military officer, I've been working in the intelligence area for quite a bit. So if you ask me about pros and cons, I'm the one to tell you mostly about the pros. Because from my perspective, any operation conducted without the use of intelligence is going in somewhere blind. And obviously nobody wants to go in blind somewhere. So for example, if you want to drive somewhere and you have to use a bridge to get there, and the bridge is being knocked out and you have to drive all the way around it to get to your goal, that would be information you would like to have beforehand, because you would bring more gasoline to make sure that you reach your goal. That is a silly example, but that is what intelligence does. It provides you with information, and based on that information, you make your decisions. That same goes for threat to troops. If you know that a certain group is in an area, you might want to go there to sort of confront this group, or you might just not want to be there because you don't want to be seen with this group in a picture, because that might be sensitive in a newspaper or something. So intelligence really helps you to make the best possible plan. It also makes sure that you make well use of scarce resources you have. Small example, if there's a village leader of whom you know spends 3 days in a village, and you want to speak this village leader, then you will visit them in these 3 days. If you don't have this information, you will attend the village without him being there. You've been driving up and down for nothing. Those are simple examples, but it should show you that without intelligence, you spend scarce resources and doesn't make the mission as effective as it could be. So from my perspective, as I stated in the beginning, without intelligence, you are blind, and nobody wants to go in blind. Yes, you have to realize that intelligence is only the torch in the dark. So there's always darkness around you, what you don't know. But I rather know a little bit than knowing nothing at all and having no intelligence.
Thank you. So definitely a necessary part for any operation, and whether it's military or policy-wise, but also its pros and cons. And Ms. Rekeling, you already started mentioning the Mali mission, so now we will further go into our second topic, which will be specifically focused on the MINUSMA mission in Mali. So as a first question, I would like to ask, besides what we already mentioned in the introduction, why was the peace mission in Mali established to begin with? What were the reasons for it, and what were the main driving forces behind the mission? Ms. Rekeling, if you could answer that.
Yeah, so the MINUSMA mission in Mali, as already mentioned, it's an integrated peacekeeping operation set up after a coup d'etat, secessionist takeover of the northern part of the country, and also a terrorist threat. And that basically made the country collapse. So beforehand, you had an African peacekeeping mission, AFISMA, and you had a small political mission from the UN, but that was not enough. So eventually, the UN took over the AFISMA mission, integrated the political mission into one big peacekeeping operation. And since MINUSMA is operating in a very high threat environment and is also confronted with many casualties, intelligence has been considered as an essential element for the mission. So at one point, there was this Dutch-European initiative of setting up an all-source intelligence fusion unit, the ASIFU. And that came at a time when multiple European nations were downscaling their military contributions to countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, and their appetite for joining a UN mission was growing at that time. So the UN had a need for intelligence, and the European countries had some form of a solution. And that's where the Dutch contribution in intelligence for MINUSMA came from. But MINUSMA in itself is a broader peace operation and not just an intelligence operation.
And based on that, because the Mali is located in the western part of Africa, I would like to ask a question to Mr. Alderton. Since I've already mentioned that a lot of Western methodologies and technologies were brought into the region, what were the main challenges faced for the people in the mission, and how did you try to cope with them?
Yeah, to be quite honest, there were quite a lot of challenges, but I will mention just a few because we only have about an hour. But let's start with the statement that Mali is immense. It's a very fast, big country. And if you bring in intelligence units, you actually would like to see or have the opportunity to cover the whole country. So that was not the case. there was just a small radius around Gao in the southeast part where the Dutch ISR company was stationed, where units were able to drive out or drones were able to fly out, but it didn't really cover the whole area in the east. And the same was the case for the Swedish ISR task force in Timbuktu. So just imagine a very big map, and you just have a couple of circles on this map. That was the area that the ASIFU could actually see. Of course, there are other means where you can gather information like social media or radio, or that's not really geographically located. But the country was so immensely big that you always had the feeling that you were missing almost everything. And then the torch in the dark metaphor comes in place again. We were very aware that we were just shining with a torch in the dark. Another, I would say, challenge for the mission in Mali was the amount of troops. As stated before, intelligence should enable a commander to make a plan and to react or be proactive and achieve mission goals. So if you want to do that, you have to have troops who can actually do that. And the fact in Mali was, and actually still is the case, that the most troops are actually committed to either base protection or convoy operations, so self-sustainment, so to say. There's hardly any capacity left to react to a specific intelligence report, and that is a pity. So you get the feeling that you produce all these nice products, but if nobody's able to respond to those products, then who are you providing these products for? And that can be frustrating from time to time, because if you see something, you want to get it handled. And if that's not the case, then, well, that is frustrating. So I told my guys, focus on the products we provide and don't look to what's done with these products, because you might get disappointed. Another factor that is worth mentioning is the internal cohesion in the mission. MINUSMA, as an integrated mission, has a military pillar, a civilian pillar, and a police pillar, of which the military pillar is the biggest, but the most influential is the civilian pillar. And just imagine having these three pillars working really as pillars. So there was hardly any interaction between those pillars. And on my level, I was working in the sector East. So in the sector East, there was a police element as well. There was a military component, a brigade from Bangladesh. And there was a police component. So I tried to link up with these components to sort of synchronize. Let's say I tried. So it's just a fact that every pillar has its own agenda and its own interests, and it's very difficult to get these together. And another point that is worth mentioning is the differences between troops. So they often use the phrase in Mali that you have the skiing nations and the non-skiing nations, referring to the Europeans and, well, the non-Europeans, so to say. And there's a big difference if you see what kind of equipment we use when we go on patrol compared to what the, for example, Nigerian battalion had when they went on patrol, without any armor, without any armored vehicles, without the proper training to, for example, counter improvised explosives. And that eventually led to this immense difference in the amount of casualties on the non-skiing nation side. And, well, there were actually no casualties other than by accidents with the skiing nations. And you can imagine that sort of, we all wear the same blue beret. We are all part of the same UN operation. But if you bring those two together, there are two complete different worlds. And well, you can imagine that it's that brings tensions in the mission too. So not an easy environment to operate in.
And you already briefly now talked about a bit more of the humanitarian impact, and I see there's an interesting question from Bas Jacobs in the Q&A box, and he asks if the UN mission in Mali, he argues, had a significant humanitarian impact, and he asks to what extent, if any, does intelligence gathering include listening to the concerns and needs of local population? Could you maybe try to combine this with your experience in the Mali mission, or maybe if Mrs. Regeling has something to add to this question?
Well, I can shortly kick off. So we call that human intelligence, short HUMINT. So the information coming from the people was actually the most important information we could get. So yes, we were listening to the population, but on the other hand, my unit had a tasking, and we had specific topics that we had to figure out, so to say, a certain puzzle to lay. So we were, as an intelligence unit, not dedicated to solve this humanitarian crisis. We were there to support the mandate of the UN mission. So, for example, one topic that we had to look into was if the signatory group, so everybody who signed the peace agreement, was actually keeping to the peace agreement. And it's actually a very good question, because that is, as a soldier on the ground, that is very frustrating, that you drive through the city of Gao and you see all this poverty, and you drive by with all these bottles of water in your car, and you know, so the contrast is very big. But you have to imagine that with only 11,000 people roughly, the UN is not gonna change the situation in Mali overnight.
Yeah, and it's not just the military component that is frustrated by that, or the intelligence of the military component. It goes for a lot of the civilian pillars as well. The civilian staff in the UN mission, in the MINUSMA mission, was not extremely large. It was mostly the agencies, funds, and programs that had some capacity to do something in Mali. But still, the civilian components of the mission, they were very, well, I would almost say desperate to get out into the country and try and see how they could help the local population. But at the same time, they were also told that the security situation was in a lot of areas in the country not safe enough from them to go by themselves. So they would need the military escort, the force protection to get to those locations. And to get the planning, first of all, the planning synchronized so that the civilian staff and the military staff would be at the same time ready to go to the same area. That was already a challenge, but even worse was that the scarce capacity of the militaries, as Mr. Alderton already said. It's such a huge country, so with such limited assets that we had available, a lot of the civilian staff could also not get to those areas to actually talk to the population, to help them, and to see what kind of projects they could quickly implement. So it was a real challenge.
Yeah. And if we are talking about certain challenges, there's another great question in the Q&A box as well, and that's a question that is arguing that with growing anti-UN/anti-foreign intervention sentiments in Mali, has collecting intelligence become more complicated? What do you think about this statement? Do you indeed feel that there is this anti-foreign intervention sentiment, and if so, has collecting intelligence indeed become more difficult?
Who do you want this question to answer?
Yeah, I thought maybe you could answer this, Mrs. Regeling. Yeah, I thought we were talking now, so I thought we'd just continue.
Yeah, sure. Well, to be honest, the last time I was in Mali was in 2018. So my information is a tiny bit dated. While I was posted in the Joint Mission Analysis Center, but I was in 2013 and 14, there was not really that much of an anti-UN or anti-foreign intervention sentiment yet in the area. and everyone was quite welcoming. But as I just said earlier in an earlier question about the retaliation of certain armed groups or terrorist groups for people that actually speak to foreign militaries or to the UN in general, being either threatened or killed. You can see that in certain areas there's absolutely a tendency of local population not wanting to interact with the UN, and the UN in that sense is broader than just the militaries. It also goes for some of the humanitarian actors with the UN flag that are no longer welcome in certain areas because of threats that are made by the armed groups or terrorist groups. So yeah, there is a bit of a tendency there. Personally, I haven't seen a general tendency of being anti-UN, but that's just because of a lack of recent experience.
Then I have one more question for you, Mr. Regeling, then we'll ask a question to Mr. Alderton. And that question mainly...
Can I shortly add to that?
Yeah,
because
sure, of course.
I really think that is a great question. And so last experience of Ms. Regeling is 2018, mine is 2016. And my answer to the question would be yes. So the mission in Mali started actually as of 2014. I was there in 2016. So already 2 years on the ground. And we noticed a fatigue with the population, that they had no interest whatsoever to talk with the UN anymore. Because what have you achieved in those 2 years that you've been here? You've been driving around, you've been destroying our roads, you've been harassing our daily life, and what's in it for us? We've not seen any results of it. And so yes, it actually influenced the amount and perhaps also the quality of the information that we collected by talking to people. Difficult thing is with people, you never know if they're lying or they're not sharing the information they have. But we actually noticed that people were getting fed up. And we sort of tried to change that, which was sort of a creative way to collect intelligence. So relatively at the end of my deployment, we decided that we want to bring something to the people as a gesture to make sure, well, to be more likable, if you would like, and in the hope for that we can get some information out of it. So we had an operation set up of multiple days, bringing in goods that were all sort of goodies were being collected out of the Netherlands, and eventually we drove into this area and started handing out stuff and making a connection with the local population, and that eventually worked out. So by having a more of an open stance to the population and bringing something, in this case a very small gesture, a token, you immediately see a response from the population because they see that you actually bring something. Again, great question, and absolutely that influences the effect of intelligence, definitely.
Yeah, it really was an interesting point. And actually, I want to ask if we can maybe take one step back. We're still looking at the Mali mission, but we're also asking ourselves about the intelligence gathering itself. Is that mostly done by Dutch personnel? This was just a question we had beforehand, and maybe you could elaborate on that as well. Ms. Regeling, maybe?
Well, no, it was not mainly done by Dutch personnel. I mean, yes, the Dutch were sent there to collect intelligence for the whole of the mission, but that was only, as Alderton just said, in a specific part of the country and a specific part of the mission area. As he also mentioned, there was another unit from a different nationality in the western part of the country. And in addition to that, there's this military expression that goes, every soldier is a sensor. And there were more than 10,000 military personnel in the Mali mission, including 7 non-Dutch infantry battalions that also got out and gathered some information, not as specific intelligence unit, but still they went out and gathered information. So yeah, there was absolutely a big Dutch task force doing intelligence gathering, but there was a lot more personnel that also did that.
Yeah. And could you maybe like distinguish some sort of difference in modus operandi when it comes to like different units from different countries as well?
Partially, at least. First of all, what Mr. Alderton already said is that a lot of the Western countries that were participating in the MINUSMA mission, they were sent there specifically for intelligence gathering tasks. So they brought their intelligence gathering equipment, whether they be flying the drones or the how do you say that, electronic warfare sensors or whatsoever, in their ISR units to drive around town. The non-Western units that were there did not have that much high-tech stuff. But what they had as a benefit to them, at least some of them, coming from the area, as I said, the AFISMA mission that was there before was made up of African nations from the vicinity of Mali. So they had this big cultural background. So they could easily speak to the local population, could easily understand the culture and the traditions within the area. So I wouldn't say that the one is per se better than the other, but there were definitely differences. Yeah.
And then I have one more question for Mr. Alderton, and that's maybe what caused the MINUSMA mission to develop in the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus, and what has it taught UN over the last, say, 8 years?
I think a big part of this question has already been answered by Ms. Regeling. So what eventually led to this ASIFU, this All Sources Intelligence Fusion Unit in MINUSMA, the Mali mission in UN, is the combined factors of the UN realizing that they need intelligence, the fact that Western nations were leaving Iraq and Afghanistan and had troops available. Very important point is also, and in the end, the deployment of troops is always politics. But for the Netherlands, there was an interest to get a rotatable seat in the UN Security Council. So the Netherlands were very proactive in lobbying for this rotatable seat. And what would be better than contributing to a UN mission to show that you're actually a good contributor to the UN. So there was this political interest, this political drive as well, and bringing all these factors together eventually made that ASIFU saw the light, so to say, in 2014. So it had quite an history. But it eventually ended up in this unique organization for the UN. What has it taught the UN? There's also something Ms. Regeling already explained. I find it
Is it just me messing this?
Yeah,
or?
no, I think he has frozen a bit indeed. So I think we just wait for Mr. Alderton, I think, to get back. Maybe because we're waiting for him to get back, maybe we can ask one of the questions, maybe a bit more general, that maybe you can answer from the Q&A box, Mrs. Reeg. So I will just check, and maybe it is an interesting question. How does the daily work of an intelligence officer in such missions look like? I see that Mr. Alderton is back. So maybe, Mr. Alderton, if you could continue with your answer, and then we'll get back to the question for Ms. Regeling.
So what was the last thing you heard?
Let's see. I think you were going into the second part of the question. So it was more about what it is taught UN in that sense.
Yeah, I think the most tangible result, and it's actually a very cheerful thing to hear, is what Ms. Regeling already told, is that as of 2017, a intelligence policy has been created within the UN. Can you imagine, with all the member states of the UN having 100 and I don't know exactly how many members the UN had, but more than 180, I would say so. It's an immense result. So I think that is the most tangible thing, of which I'm convinced that the intelligence contribution in Mali eventually added up to. Next to that, on a somewhat more lower level, a lot of personnel from other, so to say then, non-skiing nations have been trained in intelligence as well. So there's been a lot of sharing of experiences and knowledge. And not only that, I've also understood that by now courses have been produced or created by the UN, and people, before they come into the mission in Mali, are actually trained to conduct intelligence before they go into theater. So there are just some examples that I would say that actually this contribution to the UN mission in Mali has definitely paid off.
Yeah, thank you for answering the question, even though we had a bit of an issue back now, but thank you for the answer. It was really clear indeed. And I just asked Mr. Regeling a quick question. Like, there was someone who asked, what does the daily work of an intelligence officer in such mission look like? So maybe a bit more in that sense, yeah, a bit more of an informal or practical question, but I think it's quite interesting indeed. So maybe you could elaborate on this.
Yeah, it depends greatly on what kind of task you have in the mission. I can imagine that the daily work of Mr. Alderton in an ISR company was completely different than my job as an analyst within the Joint Mission Analysis Center. First of all, the level which you work on, the one being more tactical, the other one being a bit more operational, strategic. But as for my specific job as an analyst there, it meant that I needed to get my information from the different, mostly from the different mission components. So from the civilian components, police, and also the military. And then within the civilian component, which is not just one pillar, but it consists of a lot of substantive sections, make sure that you get all the information required, but also that you know what kind of intelligence requirements the leadership of the mission has. And then make sure that you get the reports done in time to the decision makers, in this case, for me, senior leadership. So it would just be relatively simple, coming into the office, seeing what kind of reporting is there, seeing what kind of reporting is missing, getting out, get that reporting, and then start writing reports based on what is available and what is asked for.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering the question. Maybe, Arnis, if you would like to ask the last question, or one of the two last questions we have formulated ourselves, and then we can maybe go to the bit more Q&A part, just answer some questions from the Q&A box, also due to the time, I think.
Yeah. So for the last general question from I'd like to also combine it with one of the questions that was in the chat box. So the question itself is, what has, since a lot of Western technologies and Western approaches are used in Mali, and what did this bring? What sort of consequences and troubles did bringing such Western methods into the region bring? And also combining this with the question from the audience, how does it differ from the non-Western operatives that were in Mali? How did their modus operandi sort of differ from Western branches? Mr. Alderton, if you would like to start.
Yeah, to start with the last question, to be quite honest, they didn't really have a modus operandi, from my point of view, how to deal with intelligence, and that is very sad because it costs a lot of lives. They would have the ability to drive the same routes over and over again in the same formation over and over again, and driving over improvised explosive devices over and over again. And that is just a sad thing because it costs life, and there was no sort of learning curve or try to use intelligence sort of to make sure that you save lives and actually reduce the threat to the force. So by the end of our tour, we were assigned to teach the other troops in how to conduct intelligence. But imagine there's an African officer who doesn't even know how a computer works, who speaks French and no English. How are you going to teach him how intelligence work when we are used to work with NATO English procedures? So that's quite a big gap. But yeah, sad to say that their SOPs were not that developed, and eventually that cost a lot of lives. What it actually, the modern assets, what did that bring for the mission in Mali, or perhaps the UN in general, is what I already said. I think that in the end, after a couple of years now, we can see that by bringing in such a sophisticated intelligence apparatus in this UN mission eventually paid off at the local level, because after I left, the Germans took over and they continued with teaching the non-skiing nations using intelligence. So we kept on investing in sharing knowledge and experiences. Internal procedures have been created. Eventually this ASIFU element started off as a independent organ, but as of 2018 it was actually integrated in the UN military component, and thereby also teaching the UN how to handle such an integrated, sophisticated intelligence unit. And then the examples I already mentioned, that the UN courses that are being given worldwide, up to the policy at the highest level, that the UN actually now has a policy describing how to handle intelligence within the UN. I think that this the payoff is really great.
Thank you. Ms. Tegeling, do you maybe have anything to add from a more analytics point of view, sorry, that what the Western assets brought to the peace mission?
Yeah, to peace missions in general, or to the MINUSMA in
more specifically Mali, how it affected it there.
Well, there were some, and Mr. Alderton already mentioned it. There were some tensions at one point between the ASIFU being a quite closed and separate intelligence unit with a lot of assets. It also meant that the expectations from the rest of the mission were quite high of what the ASIFU could do and could see throughout the country. So the expectations from the outside were that ASIFU could see and do everything and knew everything what was going on in the country, while at the same time they saw ASIFU kind of as a black box, because they found that there was not enough information coming out of the ASIFU, while at the same time still the non-ASIFU nations with their troops driving on IEDs and being killed. So there was this tension around it's a bit like the we and they kind of distinction that was growing in the mission. And it's not completely fair, because ASIFU did share, of course, everything that was relevant within the rest of the mission, but it was a perception. So expectation management was quite important in the mission, and that failed a bit, which was one of the main reasons for the merger and disbanding the ASIFU concept into a more integrated structure. The technology in itself, we've seen that there's been quite good results from the technology that was brought in. And also because of that, MINUSMA was, from the UN point of view, seen as some sort of laboratory for all things technology-wise that could be trained and tested. So MINUSMA grew a bit as a testing ground for all kinds of technology, not just from intelligence and Western nations, but also from other sides. So I guess that's kind of a good development for MINUSMA itself. More in general, I would say that Mr. Alden is absolutely correct in that the developments in Mali by ASIFU and the Western nations kind of pushed the UN to further develop procedures, guidelines, policies, training concepts into what it is now. So it is absolutely, there has been effects.
I think maybe it's time for one last question from from attendees. I think time-wise maybe two, if we're lucky in that sense. So I will suggest one, and after that, Arnis can suggest one from the Q&A box. So I saw an interesting question relating to China and its deployment in the MINUSMA mission, and it's basically the question is, what is their added value to the mission? So for China in particular, is maybe able for Mrs. Regling to answer this question?
Yeah, it is. Let me first say this is my personal opinion, just the UN opinion. China has at one point in their history decided we are gonna be more engaged, especially with troops in UN missions. The troops in the UN mission in Mali, what they have are not intelligence troops. So their main task is force protection, and especially base protection. The good thing, I think, is that China, by engaging in the MINUSMA mission, also sees and experiences what the threat in Mali is. And because of the higher threat, they are also more interested in development of procedures to counter that threat. And one of those things is, of course, intelligence. So in the course of the development of the policy, but also the military peacekeeping intelligence handbook and the training material for training of trainers, China has been very involved and very willing to help develop the training curricula from the UN. So how effective they are on the ground, I cannot really comment on, I don't know. But the fact that they are there and that they are willing to help and assist, I think it's good for the UN.
Thank you for your answer. Mr. Alderton, do you want to maybe elaborate on this question, or do you in that sense agree?
Yeah, I can only share personal observations because in Gao there was this medical installation run by the Chinese. And well, let me share one anecdote. On one day there was a civilian who had a terrible car accident, and eventually the UN decided to help and transported this wounded civilian into the medical installation on the UN camp. And eventually they ended up obviously at the Chinese door, but instead of helping this wounded civilian into the medical installation, they first took out all the cameras and started filming and photographing, not so much the wounded individual, but the troops bringing her in. So you draw your own conclusions based on that observation. My personal opinion would be, and it's very obvious in the numbers, that the Chinese have increased their contribution to the UN significantly over the last years. And as I stated before, the UN mission is also a political tool to achieve national interests. And to my personal opinion, that is exactly what China does at the moment.
Thank you both for the very good answers, especially on the sort of level which they want to achieve in the area. Sadly, we are running out of time, so we were going to have to wrap it up for today. I would like to thank both of the speakers very much for joining us today, for sharing your insights and for giving us more of an idea of what the UN intelligence gathering is, and especially the case in Mali and what happened there. Secondly, I would like to very much thank the audience, and thank you for being with us for tonight for this hour, and hopefully it brought you more insights into the sphere of intelligence operations and in general the UN missions in regards to intelligence. And of course, if you want to stay up to date with our future events, and our webinars, you can follow the Jason Institute on our social media, which is on our Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and also a recording of the webinar will be uploaded shortly. And you can share it with others if you wish so.
And one more final note, the next event will be the 11th of February, and it will be about Belarus as being the last dictatorship of Europe. So also quite interesting topic. And on the 9th of April, we'll have our anniversary of Jason Institute, our 45th anniversary in that sense, in the Grote Kerk in The Hague. It will be hybrid in that sense, of course, depending on what the virus does. And for more information, you should check our site. And finally, I would very much like to thank both speakers once more, Mr. Regeling and Mr. Alderton, for your time. It was very interesting. And well, maybe for future events, we'll see each other again. So thank you so much.
Very welcome, and I would like to offer, I can see that there are about 20 questions that are still unanswered. I do have some time left. If this room stays open, I'm happy to sort of write answers to the question for those who are interested in it. So just like to offer that.
Yeah, then for us, for me and Arnis, I think I will just like mute our cameras and video, but indeed you can just answer them in the chat box.